Sheldon Leonard pulled the plug after 3 seasons. It was a top 10 show. Now, the third year, they moved it opposite Carol Burnett, and the ratings came down, but they were still good, very good, and the demographics were excellent. And so NBC wanted to pick it up for 2 more years, not just a single-year renewal like they usually do. We'll take a 4th season, and maybe later we'll say we want a 5th season. They wanted to renew it for 2 more years. And Sheldon was promised a second hour on the network, and he came up with a show called My Friend Tony. And NBC, Mort Werner, did not like My Friend Tony. And so he called Sheldon, and he said, we don't have that second hour for you. And so you're going to have to choose which show you want to do, assuming he's going to say I Spy because it's a hit. And Sheldon was very angry that NBC was pulling this on him because he was promised that second hour. So he called Mort Werner back, and he said, okay, we're going to do My Friend Tony.
Oh, wow.
So NBC stuck it in a terrible time slot and canceled it after 13 weeks. I Spy went into syndication. Sheldon owned the show, so he had the power to do that. It was the first privately owned TV show. He financed it. He did it. He got to shoot it around the world. He didn't have to go to NBC asking for more money. He could spend whatever he wanted because he owned the show. They would license it for a certain amount of money, but he owned it, and he owned it for reruns. So Sheldon just decided he had sunk a lot of money into the show. He didn't like what NBC was pulling. He and Bob Cope were locking horns over the scripts. And so he just said, I don't need the trouble anymore. And he pulled the plug on it. But he told Bob and Bill that the ratings had dropped. And they knew they'd come down because they'd gone up against Carol Burnett. She was really hot that year. And they had been, like, winning their time slots. Suddenly they're not. But they didn't see the actual reports because they weren't shared with actors back then. Nielsen made them private. They said at the bottom, these cannot be photocopied. Return them to A.C. Nielsen. They were loaning them to the networks for a fee. And the reason they didn't share them with actors is because if you saw your show was a really big hit, you'd be asking for a raise. That's why actors now get paid $1 million an episode. Where back then they were making $5,000 an episode, which would be like $50,000 now. So it was keeping the ratings a secret. So Bill and Bob just believed Sheldon when he said the ratings had fallen. They had already written scripts for a 4th year. They had already gotten their shots. They were going to be going to Bangkok. And then after Bangkok, they were going to be going over to Sweden and then to England. And he was trying to set a deal where they could actually film in Russia behind the Iron Curtain. And Russia was interested in letting them come over there and do it, remarkably. And with all that planned for the 4th season, the plug is pulled. And so they just moved on. And when I brought this information to Bob Cope, he was stunned. And he said, no, I don't believe it. I don't believe Sheldon would not tell us the truth about that. And I said, Bob, here's the documents. And he got depressed. I talked to him a few days later, and he sounded really down. He didn't sound like Kelly Robinson at all, And he said, well, I've believed something for all these years, and I find out it wasn't true, and that I wasn't told the truth by a colleague, and it just really kind of knocked him down. And he said, I called Bill, and he believes it. He believes it because I read him the papers and all that. And then about a week later, I called him up because I had to schedule a couple more interviews. And I called him up, and he sounded like Kelly Robinson again. He sounded great. I said, you sound terrific. And he said, yeah, you know why? And I said, why? And he said, for the same reason I sounded lousy last week, because of what you told me. But the reason I sound good now is I realized we went out on top.
Oh, yeah. That show, Sheldon probably was the worst mistake he ever made. If the show went on to 5 seasons, when it goes into syndication, you make so much more money. This was I think a major mistake that Sheldon did.
Oh, it was. And he suffered. He was the top producer in television at that point. And after he pulled it away from NBC, you don't do that to a network. A network will get even. So the first thing they did is they took that My Friend Tony, stuck it in Sunday nights at 10 o'clock, I believe, and canceled it after 13 weeks, didn't promote it. Contractually, they had to put it on, but they can't guarantee a hit, but they can sure guarantee a failure.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what they did.
They buried the show.
And he went from being the top producer in television all the way down within a couple years. Because Andy Griffith's show went off, because Andy Griffith said, I've done enough. We've been on for 8 years. Dick Van Dyke was tired. He wanted to stop. Danny Thomas was tired. He wanted to stop. And suddenly Sheldon doesn't have any shows on anymore. And everything he's trying to do, the networks aren't interested in. Well, because you cross a network and it's a small town. I mean, he pulled a hit show away from a top network, and suddenly he's not working, and you find out that you're not as powerful as you thought. So he suffered. And I Spy was number one in syndication for the first year it was off the network, but it only had about 84 episodes. So after a couple years of syndication, it kind of tapered off, and it's been out of sight for a long time, which is a shame because it's such a pioneering show, such an important show in the history of television, and it was a very good show.
Well,
and what a great title sequence it had. I love that title sequence. I think that and Hawaii Five-0 are probably the two best opening title sequences in the history of television.
Oh, yeah.
And just a fantastic show. So, I'll still watch it, but I don't know if a lot of other people do. But I've written a book so if anybody out there is interested in knowing how they did it, how they went around the world, how they got this mix of white and black on the network TV and everything else, it's all in the book.
Well, the problem is, with Bill Crosby being in prison right now and all the, the flack he's under, nobody on the cable channels will carry I Spy.
Nope.
The only way I can
the Cosby Show.
Yeah.
Or the Cosby Show. Yeah, they're lepers now. They won't touch them.
Yeah, the only way I can see it is go on the internet.
It's a shame. We'll never understand what happened with Bill and how he turned like that or why he did that and so forth. I don't even like to think about it because I admired him all my life. He was one of my heroes. Loved his comedy albums, loved that show, loved what he represented for blacks and the positive image he portrayed. And he was very gracious and friendly to me when I interviewed him. And so this was just a big shock and a great sadness and a heartache. But the show is important, and the show's there. And it's a shame that a lot of people do that. When somebody falls from grace, and this is a big fall, but when somebody falls from grace, it's like all the good work they did in the past is erased. And I don't know if that's right. I don't think it's good tearing pages out of history books.
Yeah, I mean, if we didn't have I Spy, seriously, a lot of shows that came afterwards would have never happened. And plus, again, it was like one of the first shows where they went worldwide and traveled. They really got into the shows, and I have to be honest with you, Robert Culp.
Well, let me tell you, Gary, you're absolutely right, and let me tell you how right you are. I mean, first of all, Star Trek would have still come on the air. It would have come on the very next year, but it wouldn't have had an interracial cast. So that's an entirely different Star Trek. Secondly, I mentioned Hawaii Five-0 a moment ago. That show ran for 12 years. That show would have never happened because it was Fuad Sayed's equipment that was being used on I Spy that was then used on Hawaii Five-0 because there was no production facilities in Hawaii. That was a very ambitious show and a pioneering show. And Bullet. You remember the movie Bullet with Steve McQueen?
Oh, yeah.
Fuad Sayed's equipment, the I Spy equipment, was used for that car chase down the hills and everything else because they were shooting up there in San Francisco during their third year. And they went on to hiatus. And so Fuad stayed up there with his little cameras and his light equipment, his wireless microphones, and they put them in Steve McQueen's Mustang. And that put us, the audience, inside that car. We had never seen anything like that before. We had never experienced anything like that in a movie before. So many things, when a show is an important show, like I Spy, like Star Trek, things grow out of it. Like the Beatles. Groups grow out of the Beatles. Music grows out of that music. When you have that big of an impact, so it's like dropping a pebble in water and watching the ripples go out there. Now you take that pebble away, it's a whole different world.
Yeah. And, I hate to say it, Robert Culp told me, and this was like a couple of weeks before he, passed on, we were texting back or emailing back and forth. I think he was getting bitter because, he was typecast. And, he wrote his own movie with Bill Crosby. It was kind of a takeoff of I Spy, but as being detectives. And it was a
Hickey Boggs.
Yeah.
Boggs. And he directed that as well. It was a wonderful movie.
Yeah, I loved it. But, the critics just slammed it.
Yeah. And I don't know why. It's a good movie. And that was, if it had been a hit, that would have launched Robert Cope as a director, as a writer. He was already writing scripts for I Spy. And, but he wanted to direct too. And so he wore 3 different hats in that movie and did them all wonderful. I think it's a great movie, and he loved it, but it didn't hit. It didn't hit, and so that killed that. But he, they were offering him series. He was burned out from I Spy, traveling around the world for 4 years. It was on for 3 seasons, but it was in production for 4. So traveling the world for 4 years and writing scripts on your days off, for the show and so forth. And they made the banter up. They would rewrite every script. He and Cosby would sit down and change the dialogue in every one of these scripts. So they're working like you can't imagine. And after 4 years of that, he was exhausted. And so he didn't want to do another TV series for many years and didn't until America's Greatest Superhero. But they offered him a lot of stuff. Gene Roddenberry offered him a show called Spectre in the late 70s. He did the pilot, and NBC liked it, and they wanted to do a series based on it. And he backed out at the last minute. He said, I didn't agree to do a series. I agreed to do a TV movie. And now you want to make a series out of it. I don't want to do the series. And NBC said, well, if we're not going to have him, we don't want to do the series. That's how much in demand he was. But he didn't want to do that. Did you know right before he died, he actually got a green light on a script that he had written and rewritten and been carrying around for a lot of years.
Oh, yeah.
On Terry and the Pirates. One of his pet projects, a dream project he always wanted to make. And they finally got a green light, and they had the funding, and he was going to direct it. And the last time I talked to him, he was really excited about that, and he was showing me the storyboards and everything. And then he went out for a walk. He was in great shape. He went out for a walk, and he fell and hit his head on a rock and died. And they don't know, or I never found out. I went to the memorial service with his family, and they didn't know then. They didn't know if he had had a heart attack and fallen and hit his head, or if he had just fallen and hit his head and then had a heart attack. But the two things combined caused his death. But I remember him saying, being all happy that day when I got him on the phone, and he says, "You know what? We went out on top, and that's how I feel good when I stop feeling bad when I think about it, because when he died, he knew he was going to get this pet project made, and he was feeling like he was on top of the world." Now,
wasn't that going to be filmed in Hong Kong or somewhere?
I believe so.
Yeah. He was telling me a little bit about it, and I think maybe a couple months before he had this happen to where he died, he was, going there and, walking the streets where they wanted to, film it and all this stuff to get ideas. So, I mean, It's sad that he passed. He was a great guy.
And his daughter was out there. She was a teacher teaching English as a second language, and she was in Hong Kong. And when I was interviewing him for the books, he said, "Mark, get a picture of me and Bill being pulled around in those carts." I can't think of the name they're called, but where the runner takes you through the streets, and you're sitting in that carriage. And so I got him one of those promotional pictures, because it's an authorized book, and so we had access to all the pictures. And I got him one, and he framed it and sent it out to his daughter, who was in Hong Kong at that time. And it was shortly after that they got the green light on this thing, and I know that was one of the places he wanted to go do some filming.
Oh yeah,
I think he was about ready to leave on a location scouting trip.
Yeah, well, I know that he just about a month or two before that he went to Hong Kong. And he told me that he walked the streets and he was getting all these ideas and for the movie and all that stuff. And he was really proud. Again, it was strange. Like, the first couple, when I went onto his website, I never thought he would respond. And, and I figured, this guy is a jerk, because he was really hostile towards me. And then I kind of said something back, and, he was kind of still hostile. And then I said something else, and all of a sudden he just totally changed, and it was weird.
There were two Bob Culps. Robert was kind of a brooding method actor who got trained at the Lee Strasberg classes in New York City in the 50s, and was a stage actor and did a lot of live TV and went on from there and was into writing and so forth. And that's Robert. That was the serious side. And then there was Bob, who was like Kelly Robinson.